This is a chapter from my Dear Ak'i, Please Don't Be Upset, written by Faisu Mukunana, translated by yuoung Tsou, narrated by Jacqueline Schreiber. This book is available from Amazon.com. 'Tis the season to harvest palm fiber sheaths. My second aunt was sitting on a low stool, her body rhythmically moving forward and backward while sharpening a sickle on a grindstone. Her solemn face reminded me of her character. Whenever she was determined to do something for a cause, her face showed great solemnity. Second aunt's stoic personality, exhibited in various facets of her life, had been shaped through long years of hardship. Actually, she was a very soft-spoken person. Even when faced with an extremely intolerable circumstance, she would never raise her voice nor alter her tone. This was the steady, unflappable image I kept of her in my mind. Next to her, on the ground, were several sharpened knives of various kinds, thicker ones for cutting trees, thinner ones for cutting grass, and a special square knife to remove the brown protective sheath-like covering found over new palm leaves. The blade of the latter knife was about 15 centimeters in length, 12 centimeters in width. The handle of the palm fiber's knife was cast as one piece along with the knife blade, unlike knives that had separate wooden handles. Also, the size of the handle where the thumb and the index finger joined was smaller and gradually became thicker toward where the little finger held the handle, a design for the special purpose of harvesting palm fiber sheaths that required uniquely different cutting movements. Long before my summer break, second aunt had asked me to go with her to harvest palm fiber sheaths in the remote mountains. I had been helping her during winter or summer school breaks, with my parents' permission, since I was in the 3rd grade. Before I continue, some background on my remarkable aunt is in order. She became a widow before she turned 30 and raised her 2 sons by herself. In our remote village where educational endeavors were not common, her boys were academically outstanding. They both passed the entrance exams for admittance to the special normal education program at the Taiwan Normal School. The program was founded by the government of the Republic of China in those early days of the 1950s to train teachers for the educationally backward and remote villages. Even though their tuition was waived, the living expenses at the normal school had to be borne by the trainees themselves. That wasn't all. At that time, transportation was a big hassle. It took 2 days to travel from our village to Taiwan City, where the school was located. In order to avoid additional expenditures for travel and hotel accommodations, the students could only return home when the school semester was over. Second aunt would try to have saved enough money for 1 semester to give to her sons when they came home for a visit. If she hadn't, she would continue to save and send the money to them when they were back at school. She had to work doubly hard to support her boys, even doing things such as sharpening knives. It showed how much a widowed woman living under impoverished circumstances had to sacrifice for her children. In the early days, when I was a child living in our remote, isolated village, families were busy working just to provide everyone with 3 meals each day, let alone anything else. Despite passage of a compulsory education law that required every child to complete primary school, it remained rare for a student to go on to higher education. Very few families could afford to pay for their children to study in the cities. Besides, the kids had to be very competent to be able to pass the entrance exams. At that time, only 4 or 5 kids from our village could do that, and aunt's 2 sons were among them. Second aunt had the foresight to know that for her sons to create a better future for themselves, they needed to pursue higher education at a respected out-of-town institution such as the Taiwan Normal School. Prior to the advent of plastic materials, Some villagers deemed the village's climate suitable for growing palm trees and encouraged their neighbors to do so. Byproducts from the palm trees, like palm fiber, could be used to make brushes, brooms, and palm rain capes. These items could be found in virtually every household. It would take a good 5 years before the palm fibers were mature enough for harvesting, however. During that time, the soil around the palm trees required annual weeding. There were also the demands of land clearance and maintenance. Right now, though, Aunt's palm trees were ready for her to use to raise some money for her sons. The timing might have been Aunt's plan all along. Second Aunt's palm tree farm was deep in the mountains. On foot, it took 1 to 2 hours each way. In order to save time spent walking to and from the farm, she figured that if we simply stayed there, it would only take about 1 week to harvest the palms. So, at home, we gathered together everything we would need to bring with us: tools, blankets, mat sheets, pots, rice, salt, salted meat, salted fish, etc. The most important thing to remember to bring was matches. As long as matches were available, there were always wild vegetables in the mountains that could be cooked for food. Also, the palm trees that had not grown in a normal, healthy fashion could be cut down, and their young growth cooked with meat, just like villagers nowadays cook the new growth of areca palms as food. Because harvesting palm trees was a once-a-year event, there were no permanent shelters at the palm tree farms, as there were by rice fields, which were frequented more often. Therefore, upon their arrival at a palm farm, workers, like us, would clear a piece of land by a creek, using wood-cutting knives to cut down arm-sized trees for building a shelter, and pick some rattan stems to function as nails to hold the structure together. Thatch grass was collected for use as roofing and as walls. At a corner inside the shelter, a thick layer of grass would be laid down and covered with a mat sheet. Ta-da! A soft and comfortable bed was thus ready for use. It took only about an hour for the two of us to complete all of these chores. I cut a section of sweet bamboo 3 to 4 feet long, leaving the diaphragm at the end of the section. I knocked off a second diaphragm at the center of the section with a wooden stick. Voila! A piece of bamboo to use as a container to carry the water. I found 3 pieces of rock and erected them in a formation so that a fire could be lit and a pot rested on them to boil water, using dried wood that I'd found nearby. We were both quite thirsty, having had nothing to drink since we left the house before dawn several hours ago. Here in this remote mountain region, it wasn't easy to enjoy many creature comforts or ensure personal hygiene. The least we could do was exercise enough common sense to boil the water before drinking it. We knew that some people drank water straight from the streams without knowing whether or not it contained leech larvae. Once this larvae feeds on human blood, it can multiply in the human body. I heard of a classmate who often suffered from nosebleeds and over time became physically weaker. Upon examination, a doctor discovered several big fat larvae in her nostril feeding on her blood. How disgusting! Our water break over, Aunt lost no more time and got to work. Her inexhaustible energy and the swift movement of her hands and feet were the result of years of hard labor coupled with an iron will. I should add here that there were several reasons why my parents allowed me to accompany Second Aunt to the mountains. First, if something happened to her, there would be no one around to assist. Second, I had always been a nice, helpful kid and was capable of doing things. To show her gratitude, when I was younger, Aunt would make me a floral dress. When I was older, she would offer me money. Once the water had boiled, I covered the burned wood with ash to prevent it from dying out, and so that it could be lit again later when needed. This was easy. Just remove the ash Add additional dried leaves or wood sticks, blow air at the pile, and it would catch fire again. In those years when we had a meager supply of material things, even one match was very precious. Without having matches in the remote mountains, one not only couldn't cook food, but worse, could become sick from the cold. At the very least, you could not sleep comfortably. Up here, the temperature could drop to the teens Celsius at night, even in the summer. With clean water in hand, I went to where Aunt was working and asked her to take another break and have a drink. After she resumed her work, I stayed next to her and got to work myself. Carrying as much as I could manage, I neatly stacked the palm sheaths she had cut off by the side of the temporary shelter we had built. In case of rain, they would be covered with 2 large taro leaves. If they became wet, they wouldn't sell for a good price. At some time close to noon, judging by the position of the sun, I rinsed a small amount of rice, cut some yams, and cooked them together. Because there was no cutting board or yam peeler in the wild, I had to use the hob cutting method to slice the yams, which requires some skill. Here's how. Hold a yam loosely in your left hand and decide roughly how big you would like each piece to be. While controlling the amount of force to strike the yam at the correct angle, hold the knife there and push its blade outward to break off the piece of yam and allow it to fall into a pot. Continue this process with your left thumb rotating the yam in your left hand until the entire yam is cut into small pieces. Be careful to control the force precisely, lest the knife cut your hand. Cooking rice with dry wood debris also required skill. Once the water was boiling, I spread the wood sticks to lessen the intensity of the fire so that I didn't burn the rice. Once the rice was cooked, I prepared a pot of vegetable stew and invited Aunt for a meal before she went back to work, yet again. These chores were what I could accomplish when I was smaller. Once I was around 12, I learned how to harvest palm sheaths. At work, we always carried a sickle to cut grass. We carried it inside a simply made knife scabbard and tied the scabbard to the waist. Before we harvested palm sheaths, we cut the outstretched petiole or leaf stalk first, and then using the thumb and the index finger, separated the palm sheath from the remaining petiole with the sickle. After cutting off the remaining petiole and discarding it, we detached the sheath from the palm trunk along the circular knot structure line. During this process, we would embrace the trunk with our head on its right side while using the left hand to detach the sheath. Finally, we used the right thumb and index finger to forcefully cut off the last segment of the sheath, about 1 foot long, from the trunk. For each palm tree, we could harvest just 3 or 4 pieces of sheath, since any more might harm the tree. That day, we worked until dusk and cooked our dinner together. Afterwards, Aunt sharpened the knives we had used. Then we went to the creek for a quick sponge bath. While the fire was still radiating rays of warmth, and after a long day of hard work, we shared a blanket and quickly fell asleep. At night, we were awakened once in a while by loud sounds from nocturnal animals, prompting Aunt to get up and add wood to the fire. While some of the animal sounds made us feel a bit uneasy, we were so tired we would quickly fall asleep again. Because we went to bed early the night before, I awoke early. We mountain workers were used to getting up early anyway, but not as early as Aunt, who had prepared breakfast before dawn. After eating, we got right to work. We spent 6 days like this at the palm farm. A little past 7 in the morning of the 7th day, 6 or 7 men and women arrived at the farm, as per the arrangement Aunt had made with them beforehand. After a short rest, they all began to work, knowing that the earlier they started, the sooner they could go back home. They worked hard, chatting and teasing one another to make the atmosphere enjoyable. Sometimes one would sing songs and the others would sing along. They sang Tsou folk songs, theme songs from Japanese movies, and even Mandarin pop songs learned from 78 RPM long-playing records. At the time, only 2 families in our village owned a hand-powered phonograph. The normally very quiet and remote mountains suddenly became bustling. This helped too with the loneliness Aunt and I had experienced over the past 6 days. At noontime, Aunt asked me to cook more rice for the helpers, along with all of the salted pork and dried fish that had been reserved for them, even though they had each brought their own lunchbox. For these workers, this apparently wouldn't be enough food. Thanks to a supplemental hot-from-the-oven meal, they were extremely contented and worked really hard in the afternoon. By around 4 o'clock, they had finished the primary tasks. They gathered the palm fiber sheaths into bundles and, each carrying what they could, proceeded back to the village. When I was smaller, I would carry a sleeping mat, blanket, and all of the knives, pots, and pans in a basket. The road from the remote mountains back to the village was winding and treacherous, especially for team members loaded with palm sheaths twice the size of their bodies. They walked at a snail-like pace, one small step at a time, lest the heavy load on their back shift its center of gravity, making them lose their balance and fall down with it. By the time we arrived at the village, it was almost dark and everyone was tired. But no one complained. During these tough economic times, exhaustion from physically demanding work was common. It was really a way of life. Nobody ever used the word exhaustion. They simply went to bed early, got a good rest, woke up early, and started all over again. Just because all of the harvested palm sheaths were carried home didn't mean that was the end of the job. It would take 3 or 4 sunny days to dry the sheaths and wrap them up. The latter process required certain skills. You placed the best quality sheath on the ground first, and the second one to overlap it by a half sheath on one side. This was done with 5 to 6 sheaths in a row. You followed the same procedure for the second row, which was placed 1/3 lower than the first, using 1 fewer sheath per row. Repeat this for about 5 rows, then roll the whole thing up. You started rolling from one side, sometimes using your knees to assure a precision like that required when rolling Japanese sushi. Then you tied up the roll, about 4 feet high, with palm leaves or miscanthus grass. Finally, you tied 5 to 7 rolls together to make a bundle. The next step was to inquire about the current market price. Some businessmen from the plains would come to the palm sheath maker in order to procure their product. As long as we didn't borrow money in advance from a particular businessman, we could always take our time and wait for a better offer. If we had borrowed in advance, we would lose the opportunity to bargain with other buyers for a higher price. That year, Second Aunt was fortunate to receive a good bargain offer, so that not only did my 2 cousins have enough money for the entire semester, there was enough left to enable Aunt to purchase what she needed for the household. When the semester was over, the eldest cousin even brought home what was the first and only camera in our village. It was really an eye-opening experience for the villagers to see such a novel device, and they lined up to take a photo with his camera.